She wasn't a gift from the stars. She was a question sent to all of humanity. Do we deserve to survive? The research vessel Sagan 3 wasn't meant to make history. And yet, it did when it rescued a lone alien girl from the smoldering wreck of a ship drifting in Earth's orbit. Her skin shimmered softly with bioluminescent light. Her eyes large, unglowing, held something deeper than language. Recognition. Judgment. She didn't speak. But she showed. Through memories. Through visions. Through truth itself. She was a hybrid created to test mankind. Not to make peace. Not to build alliances. But to answer a silent question. When faced with something we don't understand, what will humanity choose? And, as always, we chose fear. Orders were given, contain her or kill her. Only one man stood against it, Captain Elias. And in the moment she threw herself between him and a bullet, her glowing blood struck the floor and awakened something buried beneath the station. A beacon, ancient, alien, now transmitting. The signal has gone out, and above Earth, they are watching. We are no longer the hunters in the stars. Now, we are the ones being judged. The medbay was quiet, too quiet. Only the soft hum of the ship's systems and the faint flicker of emergency lights disturbed the stillness. Inside the isolation chamber, behind a layer of reinforced glass, lay something some Anino human was ever meant to find. Captain Elias Vorn stood motionless, his breath fogging slightly against the observation panel. Beyond it, the alien woman rescued from the broken wreckage of an unidentified starship remained as she had for days, pale, unmoving, wrapped in sterilized sheets. Her body bore no wounds, no visible injuries, yet she had not stirred. Until now. Her eyes fluttered. Once, twice, then they opened. Not glowing, not otherworldly, but real, large, luminous, and unmistakably human-like. They locked onto his. Elias didn't move, didn't blink. A chill traced down his spine, not from fear, but from something else. The way she looked at him wasn't alien. It wasn't hostile. It was searching. As if she were trying to remember a dream she had once lived. One that ended with him. A soft gasp escaped her lips, no sound, only breath. Her chest rose subtly, as though learning the act of breathing for the first time. The lights above flickered, casting ripples of gold across her eyes, making them shimmer like they held a storm. Tears welled there. Not from pain, from recognition. Elias stepped back, just a fraction. Not because she frightened him, but because, in that moment, something deep inside whispered, "This wasn't just an alien. This was our first contact." And she looked heartbreakingly familiar. The room didn't feel like a lab anymore. It felt like a moment caught between worlds, between what humanity believed and what it had refused to imagine. The kind of silence that didn't just come before something important. It was the important thing. And she was awake. The room was sterile, clinical. A thin sheen of light hovered over the table like a veil that refused to lift. A dozen translation devices blinked and beeped, bouncing fragments of language across the walls, phonemes, pitch modulations, syntactic reconstructions. Nothing worked. Kalira sat still, unmoved, her posture calm but unreadable, eyes wide and patient, as though listening to something far beyond human comprehension. Around her, the scientists whispered and gestured, frustrated by her silence. Screens scrolled with failed attempts, galactic lexicons, synthetic vocalizers, even neural frequency mapping. None of it touched her. And then Elias walked in. He said nothing. Just removed the headset from his ears, set it gently on the table, and approached her, slowly. Not like a soldier, not like an interrogator. Just a man, with questions too big for words. She turned to him. Without hesitation, Kalira raised her hand. Her fingers, long and graceful, hovered in the air, then came to rest gently against his chest. Right over his heart. A soft glow bloomed from her fingertip. Dim at first, then brighter. Not blinding, just enough to feel real, like the warmth of a memory long forgotten. And in that moment, everything changed. The room disappeared. Elias stood frozen, but his mind was no longer his own. He saw. Visions flooded in, raw, vivid, Impossible to look away from. Not dreams, not hallucinations, memories. A sky of burning stars, great ships looming over dead worlds. Humanitarian people watched from afar like shadows in a mirror. There was war, so much war. Screams without mouths, fire without flame. And through it all, she stood alone. Kalira, beneath the galaxies, eyes glowing with sorrow, a witness to everything, a survivor of something ancient, something unfinished. Then, it stopped. The light faded, and they were back in the room, just the two of them, silent, changed. Elias staggered back, breath ragged, heart pounding. He didn't know her language. But now, he understood. She hadn't spoken a single word. She didn't need to. She had shown him what no translator ever could. A message beyond language, a warning, a memory, and maybe a plea. The lab lights buzzed low, sterile white over brushed metal and transparent walls. Kalira stood in the center, surrounded by silent machinist hours of sensors, scanners, and floating hollow rings orbiting her like cautious ghosts. Her expression was unreadable, calm, but there was something beneath her stillness, a tension, coiled and humming just under the surface. Then a low murmur echoed from one of the technicians. Her neck. It's not a tattoo. It's moving. The room leaned in. On the side of Kalira's throat, just below the jawline, faint traces of glowing silver began to emerge. Delicate lines shimmered beneath her translucent skin, intersecting like circuit pathways, pulsating softly in rhythm with her breath. The lead xenotech whispered in awe, "It's a living data lattice. Organic encryption." They tried to scan it, slowly at first. A low-frequency pulse emitted from the biometric reader, brushing her skin like a cold wind. She flinched. Another pulse, this one sharper. Her body jerked. Then everything snapped at once. Kalira convulsed violently. Her limbs trembled, back arching against invisible pressure. The pulse intensified, bouncing across the room, ricocheting through every panel and screen. Her eyes rolled back, and a scream half human, half electric cracked the air. A red alert flared to life. Conscious field breach detected. Neural stability compromised. Technicians panicked, hands flying across controls, yelling for containment, for shutdown, for backup. But Elias didn't wait. He burst through the decontamination seal, shoving past the stunned scientists. Protocol screamed behind him. He didn't care. He dropped to his knees beside her, arms sliding around her trembling frame. Not to restrain, but to anchor. Hey, I'm here," he whispered, his voice barely audible beneath a storm of sound and light. "You're safe. I see you." Her shaking slowed. And then, the impossible happened. Every monitor in the room dimmed. The scanner sputtered. The alarms died. One by one, the machines fell silent. The air shifted, heavy but still, as if the room itself exhaled. Kalira's breathing steadied, her eyes slowly opened wide, luminous, and fixed on him, not with confusion. With recognition. She hadn't fought the machines. She'd reacted to fear, to isolation. But with Elias there was connection, trust. And through that thread, she had touched the ship itself. Whatever she wasn't just technology. She could feel. And her feelings could bend the tools of men. The ship had gone quiet. Outside the viewport, Earth hung in the void blue, vulnerable and unaware. Kalira stood near the glass, her fingertips gliding across its surface, leaving trails of soft, shimmering light in the air. Not ink, not vapor. Something else, a luminous thread suspended like glowing silk, responding to her intent. She drew a circle. Earth. Then 5 smaller spheres orbiting at moons or waypoints. A line arced outward, connecting to a cluster of distant stars. And at the center of it all, she marked a symbol, 2 spiraling strands, intertwined, DNA, human, ancient. Elias watched from the doorway, silent, until Kalira turned and took his hand. With one motion, she guided his fingers to the glowing double helix. The moment he touched it, everything shifted. His breath caught. The world blurred. And then memories that weren't his spilled into his mind. Not images, experiences, whole, vivid, and overwhelming. He felt her creation, not born, built. Engineered within the heart of a collapsing starship, her body woven from two legacies and ours. He saw ancient skies, long before recorded time, where figures of her kind walked among primitive humans, not as gods but as architects. They modified genes, guided growth, planting fragments of themselves into early hominids like seeds, waiting for the right season to bloom. And now, that season was ending. They were coming back, not as saviors, not as conquerors. As collectors, Kalira had not been sent to wage war. She had been made to find the anomaly, the bridge, the piece of the human genome that resisted control, the one that still carried their echo. She was that echo. That link. Part of them, part of us. The memory ended. Elias stood frozen, hands still against the glowing DNA on the glass. His throat tightened with something he couldn't name. Fear, wonder, grief. His voice cracked, quiet barely more than a breath. You're part of us? Kalira nodded. Not with pride, not with sorrow, with the weight of truth. She wasn't just an alien visitor. She was a mirror to humanity's forgotten origin. And maybe, its only hope of survival. Outside, the stars shifted. And somewhere in the void, something old had begun to stir. The feed crackled with encrypted static. On the central display, the Earth Command Council appeared, faces carved from stone, illuminated by the cold glow of tactical overlays and blinking threat assessments. Behind them, screens projected Kalira's image. Vital signs, neural patterns. The DNA symbol still pulsing faintly from her last scan. She was no longer labeled survivor. She was now tagged unclassified vector, priority risk. A general slammed his palm against the table. She is not wounded. She is a signal. Another leaned in, his voice sharp and quiet. She carries them. In her blood, in her mind. We don't know what she's already transmitted. But she saved our officer, someone offered weakly. Exactly, the chairman replied. She chose him. We don't know why. The silence that followed was colder than policy. Every face on that feed bore the same unspoken truth. This wasn't discovery. This was exposure. And Earth wasn't ready. Contain or eliminate, the order came. No hesitation, no debate. It was spoken with the calm brutality of bureaucratic fear. Elias stood just off screen, fists clenched, jaw tight. His voice rose before he could temper it. She's not a threat, she's a bridge. She came here to stop something bigger than any of us. But no one was listening. The call disconnected. He was left in silence, the room around him empty except for the soft flicker of the red directive now stamped on every console. Operation Blackstone. Engage with extreme prejudice. By the time he turned, the strike team had already been dispatched. 12 soldiers. No questions, no mercy. Humanity had seen something it didn't understand. And like every frightened civilization before it, it decided to bury it. In the darkness of the ship, Elias whispered to himself more a promise than a prayer. I won't let them touch her. The emergency lights flickered once, then died. A low mechanical hum echoed through the underbelly of Sagan 3, broken only by distant footsteps and the sharp hiss of repressurizing doors. Somewhere in the dark, a cell door slid open, not by command, but by override. Manual, unauthorized. Elias moved fast, no armor, just instinct. His hand gripped Kalira's wrist as he pulled her into the shadows, their silhouettes slipping between columns of steam and half-lit bulkheads. Around them, security drones buzzed to life, scanning corridors in slow, predatory sweeps. Patrol teams barked through comms, searching, misdirected by static glitches and system misfires glitches. Elias had personally uploaded into the nav grid 30 minutes ago. Time was bleeding out. They moved in silence, their breath shallow, their steps rehearsed only by fear. And yet, Kalira wasn't trembling. She followed him not because she needed to, but because she had chosen to. In one quiet stretch of corridor, they paused. Behind them, lights swept the walls close, too close. Kalira leaned against the metal, her chest rising and falling. Her gaze drifted toward Earth through a small, viewport of fragile blue world, still unaware of how close it stood to ancient fire. A tear escaped down her cheek, her lips parted, and for the first time her voice carried through the air in soft, halting English. They will come, but I chose to come first, for you. Elias turned, stunned. It wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it, fragile, final, and filled with something deeper than language could explain. Trust. Regret. Defiance. She hadn't run from her people. She had betrayed them, risked everything to stand on human soil, to warn a species too proud to listen. His heart twisted. But he didn't have time to speak. Not now. Down the hall, boots clanged against steel. The team was getting closer. He squeezed her hand tighter, nodded once. And together, they vanished into the docking bay, missed toward a stolen shuttle, toward the edge of the atmosphere, toward the unknowable dark between stars. She wasn't just fleeing. She was declaring something greater than war. That even in the face of extinction, she chose us. Asterisk. The bay doors groaned open, releasing a hiss of pressurized air. Cold light poured in from the landing beacon's bright, sterile, unforgiving. Elias and Kalira emerged from the shadows, breathless. Before them stood the final shuttle-powered, unlocked, waiting. But they weren't alone. From the catwalks above, spotlights snapped on, boots clattered, rifles clicked. 12 soldiers closed in, surrounding them like teeth on a trap. The exit door hissed, shut behind them with a dull finality. No escape, no time. Elias Vornstep, away from the entity, a voice barked through a megaphone. No names, no humanity, just a command laced with fear. Elias stepped in front of her instinctively, spreading his arms. She's not a weapon, he shouted. She warned us. Don't you get it? She's the only one trying to stop what's coming. But protocol didn't listen. The soldiers raised their rifles. Kalira reached for his arm, her touch calm ensuring him. Go, Elias whispered urgently. There's still a way out. Take the shuttle. I'll hold them. She shook her head. No, she breathed. Then a shot rang out. Everything slowed. Elias turned just as one of the soldiers pulled the trigger, perhaps too nervous or too ready. A single plasma round tore through the air. Kalira moved without hesitation. She stepped in front of Elias, her body, catching the full force of the blast. The sound of impact echoed like thunder in a hollow world. She collapsed into his arms, glowing blood already blooming across her side, spreading like liquid starlight across the steel floor. No, no! Elias screamed, voice cracking as he dropped to his knees. Kalira! Her breathing was shallow. Her eyes, still open, shimmered with pain and peace. But the moment her blood touched the floor, something changed. The ground beneath them pulsed. A faint hum stirred deep below the docking platform. Symbols long buried, invisible to the human eye, flared to life across the metal like veins awakening in a corpse. Ancient circuitry, dormant for millennia, flickered under her blood like it had been waiting for her. The soldiers froze, weapons lowered. The air thickened with static, lights flickered. Somewhere in the core of the ship, something ancient began to move. Elias clutched her tighter, trembling. Around them, the room vibrated not from engines, but from recognition. Her sacrifice hadn't ended something. It had begun something. A key had been turned. And now, the lock was opening. The floor beneath Elias cracked not from force, but design. A perfect circle split open at the center of the docking bay, revealing a spiral of descending rings etched with symbols no human had ever seen. From that void, light surged upward, pale gold, then white-hot, humming in resonance with something ancient and aware. A shape emerged from the pit, metal but not forged, alive but not breathing. A floating disc, the size of a man, lifted into the air, slow, graceful, impossible. Its surface glowed with latticework, like flowing script. Its core pulsed with the same rhythm as the veins in Kalira's skin. A beacon, forgotten, buried, waiting for blood that matched the frequency of a forgotten covenant. It had found it. Elias cradled Kalira's body as the light wrapped around them like a soft cocoon. The soldiers stood frozen, not by orders be awe. The beacon wasn't human, but it wasn't alien either. It was older. a remnant of a pact written not in ink, but in DNA. And Kalira was the key. The beacon spoke, but not in words. It broadcasted. Far across the void, beyond charted systems and known sectors, something stirred. On a cold obsidian world orbiting a collapsed red star, a council of beings tall, silver-eyed, draped in woven light turned their heads in unison. Their vast minds received the signal. Their expressions shifted not in alarm, but in quiet understanding. "She's activated it," one said. Another, eyes narrowing. "The humans have chosen." A stillness fell. Then one, older than the others, whispered with grim reverence, "Then the trial is complete." The others bowed their heads not in sorrow. In respect, back aboard Sagan 3, the beacon rotated once more, then retracted into the light, returning to its hidden chamber. The glow faded, but the air remained changed. Elias looked down at Kalira, her breath faint but still present. And in his soul, something had shifted. She wasn't just first contact. She was the test. A mirror held to humanity, not to its power, but to its compassion. And Elias had passed. Across the galaxy, ancient eyes watched Earth anew, not with fear, but with acknowledgement. Humanity had not just made contact. Humanity had been seen. The hum of the machines was softer now, not cold, not clinical, just waiting. Kalira lay on a medbed surrounded by low light and whispered readings. Her skin, once dimmed by pain, now shimmered faintly with energy not entirely human. The wound had closed not through human medicine, but through something older, something hybrid. A gentle fusion of her kind's regenerative code and Earth's crude technology. They had saved her, yes, but only because she had let them. Across the room, Elias stood still, arms folded, eyes searching hers. She sat up slowly, her movements deliberate, as if her body was remembering itself. And then, their eyes met. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Kalira broke the silence, her voice soft but clear, like a wind passing between stars. "Now, you must decide." She placed her hand over his. "Tell your people the truth, or hide me forever." The question hung in the air, not as a challenge, but a reckoning. Elias looked down at her fingers resting on his, so warm, so human, and yet part of a species that had once rewritten the human genome like a sculptor shapes clay. He thought of Earth, its fear, its arrogance, its instinct to destroy what it couldn't explain. "They'll fear you," he said quietly. "Yes." His voice wavered. "But they fear what they don't understand." She didn't look away. "And do you understand me now?" He swallowed hard. "No," he admitted. "But I believe in you, and that's enough for me." He reached for the comm panel, his hand trembling, not from doubt, but from the weight of what came next. A single message. A single transmission. That would either unite two species or burn the bridge before it ever stood. He chose the truth and accepted the consequences. Because in the end, Elias Vorn didn't just save her. He answered the test humanity had never known it was taking. With eyes wide open, it began with light. Not a weapon's flash, not a comet's blaze, but a slow, pulsing bloom across the upper atmosphere, as if the sky itself had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. Satellites froze. Communications stalled. Every telescope, radar array, and orbital station aligned in silence as an impossible shape took form above the planet. A fleet, towering, ancient, stretching across the stars like a constellation reborn. Dzenzno, 100 soft ships hovered in perfect stillness, not advancing, not threatening, simply observing. Earth was surrounded, but no shots fired. Instead, a transmission. All across the Globian phones, on wall screens, on cracked radios in quiet rooms, the signal arrived. And in the center of that signal, haloed by otherworldly light, appeared her face. Kalira, but not as they had known her. Not as a patient, not as a prisoner, not even as a refugee. She stood in the light as something older than royalty. Not a queen, not a soldier. A messenger, a judge. The one sent ahead of the storm. Not to declare war, but to measure the soul of a species. And Earth had heard her, but it had also tried to save her. Back in the communications chamber of Sagan 3, Elias Vorn stood before the camera, his uniform torn, his eyes tired but steady. No script, no politics, just truth. She came in peace, he said, voice echoing through the void. We heard her, but we also protected her. What happens next? He paused. Is your choice. The feed ended. The image vanished. And above, in orbit, the great fleet did not move. No beams, no words, only silence. Until a single star on the edge of the sky shimmered, then brightened. A soft pulse, almost like a nod. And then one by one the ships began to drift backward, fading into the black like echoes returning to deep space. They did not invade. They did not punish. They watched and withdrew. The sky had opened, and for once had not swallowed Earth whole. Because a single act of compassion had spoken louder than 1,000 weapons. And the universe had listened. Kalira wasn't just an alien. She was a mirror reflecting everything humanity is capable of. Our fear, our violence, and our capacity to protect. We always imagined first contact would begin with a message, with light and sound. But instead it came in silence, in a single glance, and in the wound of a girl who chose to trust us. The question was never, who is she? It was, who are we when facing what we don't understand? Elias chose truth. And in that moment, he bought us time to be seen, not as conquerors, but as beings trying to be better. The alien fleet didn't attack. They simply watched. And in the darkness above, one star glowed. Not as a reward, but as a reminder. The first test is over, but the next may have already begun. If you want to know what comes next, subscribe to Alien Chronicles and prepare yourself. The universe isn't done watching us.